Hi, everybody. It is now week 6, and this week what I want to talk about and what your readings are about is this idea of situating public administration. Well, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is placing public administration in historical context, in the context of our thinking about government and about administration in the United States. So far, during the course, we've talked a little bit about our constitutional foundings. We've talked about what Wilson and Goodnow and others had to say about public administration and where it fit in. And then we talked about the legitimacy of public administration, explored some readings on legitimacy in the context of the Constitution. So this week what we want to do is kind of put public administration in some kind of historical context so we understand where we are and where we're going. So let's move right into that. Well, I gave you several readings this week, and I want to go through the purposes of the readings for this week, because I'm not going to really concentrate fully on all of them in this lecture. I'm really only going to focus on one aspect of a couple of the readings. So, the Fry and Nigro text. What was that about, and why do I have you read that? Actually, I just want you really to read through page 1176. But so Fry and Nigro pose these questions. What is public administration? Who is the administrator? What is politics? Should politics be out of administration, or should administration be out of politics? And where is the responsibility for administration located? So let me just touch on about 3 of those, and we can kind of decipher the other 2. So what is politics, right? We struggled with this in the journal and in some discussion, right? What do we mean by politics? Is it the actions by which rulers rule? Is it electoral politics? Is it politicians seeking personal advantage from the political process? Is politics inherent within human institutions? And then what is administration? So we struggled with that too. Can administrators become partisans? Does that depend on the level that an administrator serves at? Is the regulation and rulemaking process, such as the rules that the EPA produces, is that inherently political? And where is an administration situated? Is it strictly in the executive? And the point is, there's a little bit of constitutional ambiguity there. And to whom are the administrators loyal? And so those other 2 questions, let me go back to that chart for just a second. Well, we don't have to go back. The question is, do we keep politics out of administration or administration out of politics? That was a question that a lot of you came to grips with in your journals. Should administration be this strictly neutral process? Is it possible to do that? And do we keep administration out of politics? That is, should politicians or elected officials seek to become administrators? Those are some really interesting questions that Fry and Nigro pose there. So take a little bit of time to read through there. It's really kind of a summary reading, but I think it will be helpful as you sort of wrap your mind around what Wilson and Goodnow were saying. So I assigned you a couple other readings. There's the Stillman reading of 2010, which talks about eras of public administration. I'm only going to talk about that on this slide right here. And the reason why is because this is going to become clearer to you as the weeks go by. This reading I assigned to you as an intro for readings that we're going to consider within the next few weeks. So Stillman lays out the thinking in public administration into about 4 different eras. And they don't really mean much to you right now. this idea of positive core orthodoxy, social science heterodoxy, the reassertion of democratic idealism, and the refounding movement, which is followed by what I call the era of governance, which Stillman doesn't really talk about. But the point is that you can take public administration thinking and sort of put it in historical eras in retrospect. Take that reading, read it as an intro to what we're going to be talking about in the next few weeks. It's really going to be helpful to you as we start to consider the readings coming up. And so the readings that I really am going to focus on are this Stillman article from 1996, which I gave you, and a Kettle article from 2015, which I gave you. Because I want to talk about the traditions, the so-called traditions of American governance and administration, which are called the Hamiltonian Tradition, the Jeffersonian Tradition, the Madisonian Tradition, and then, to some extent, the Kettle article talks about the Wilsonian Tradition. So let me spend the rest of this lecture talking about those ideas. Okay, so we have decided that we have these three or four traditions of American governance. This is not that Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison actually sat down and said, this is my tradition of American governance. This is really based on the body of their work. And by that I mean their written work and what they did as leaders. And the Wilsonian tradition is really based on what he wrote primarily in the 1887 article, but in some other articles as well. So broadly speaking, the Jeffersonian tradition means that that tradition supports decentralized, state-centered governance. The Hamiltonian tradition relates to of a more centralized but not completely unitary government, but with a stronger executive. The Madisonian tradition really is the idea that we're setting off interest against interest. And you remember from Federalist Paper number 51, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And the Wilsonian tradition, as we've read from Wilson, is this need for an administrative structure to, what he said, run a constitution. So, in the Kettle article, we can talk about some foundational ideas. That we think public administration is the art of turning big policy ideas into solid results. So really it's an old intellectual discipline. I mean, we talk about Woodrow Wilson and Goodenow as the fathers of American public administration. And to some extent that's true, but public administration is an old practice. It's really as old as humans organizing into units to live together and to get things done. So administration is about organizing people to do complex jobs. And public administration is about organizing people to do complex jobs in pursuit of broader government-defined interests. So in short, applying public interest to the management or work of the government is what public administration is about. But governance, it's rife with conflicts, right? We have people's desire to be left alone. They say, I want government out of my business, versus the desire for government to do something about something that comes up. We have a desire to pay less in taxes versus a demand for more government services. We have a desire to run government like a business versus our desire for representation in government. We have a desire for privacy versus a desire for government to spy on terrorists and criminals, for example. So we have conflicting views about what government should be doing. And these traditions are in conflict with each other as well. But the important point to keep in mind is there was not one single era where we were living out in our government the Hamiltonian tradition. There was not one single era where the Jeffersonian tradition held sway. There was not one single era where the Madisonian tradition held sway. The point is that all three of them are within our culture and our thinking, and to some extent we really apply all of these traditions. So what is the Hamiltonian tradition? Well, Hamilton himself was a leading voice for a stronger constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. So Hamilton did believe, if you read the articles that he wrote, it's clear that he proposed a somewhat strong executive uh, as compared to the legislative. So how did we need to make the national government stronger to be more effective? And how can we make an executive powerful enough for the government to be strong? While preventing this concentration of power that the founders were very concerned about. So Hamilton proposed in Federalist 70 that we should balance independence, power, and responsibility. He wanted to see energy in the executive, and for a skilled person to be the chief executive, that is the president. He wanted to see unity in the executive to run government policies, run executive branches, and he wanted the executive to be accountable, mostly to the legislative branch. So he focused early in his career in government, really, in creating this strong government. He argued strongly for a first bank of the United States, really a predecessor of what we call the Federal Reserve today. He had a lot of opposition to that, and in fact, the idea that the United States should have a central bank was a controversial idea for many decades in the United States. It went back and forth for 100 years or more, whether we should have a central bank in the United States. So the legacy of the Hamiltonian tradition over 200 years really is that, in fact, the power of the executive has grown. And what Hamilton advocated early on, even writing some of the Federalist Papers, was that the government had a responsibility to promote the United States and to promote U.S. businesses. That's also grown in over the past 240 years. So the Hamiltonian tradition is very much among us. Well, this is from the Stillman 1996 text, and so let me decipher this a little bit for you, because it's an interesting diagram, and there's one of these each for the Jeffersonian tradition and the Madisonian tradition. Well, this is how Hamiltonian thinking in Stillman's mind affects the bureaucracy, affects administration. And so you see at the top of each of these charts, you're going to see inputs, internal subsystem, and outputs. So think of the internal subsystem, that triangle there in the middle, as the bureaucracy, and we'll just call it the bureaucracy for simplicity. And so it's shaped like a triangle. But what are the inputs to the bureaucracy? Well, the inputs are that they're adequate to meet required tasks and demands. So that's saying that in the Hamiltonian tradition, the government structure, the bureaucracy or the administration, will receive the inputs it needs in order to function. It won't operate in an ad hoc manner, in other words. So who's inside this internal subsystem? Well, in the Hamiltonian tradition, it is a highly professional cadre. It's dominant that's what's dominant, a highly professional cadre. It's unified, and it has centralized and formal structures. So in this sense, it kind of looks like what we think of as a classic bureaucracy. So what are the outputs of this thinking? The outputs are, we have clear goals and objectives, effective leadership, organizational autonomy, legal, procedural, and management tools, and necessary political support. So what we're talking about here is a highly organized kind of government structure to get the jobs of government done. That there's a feedback arrow there, which you can see, and that feedback arrow provides flexibility to tailor the system to build better inputs. So what the Hamiltonian model is looking for is really an efficient machine of government that has the support of the executive, and when it does make mistakes, it's going to make adjustments to make it even stronger. So what's the environment? And that's right there at the bottom. The environment of this Hamiltonian model is kind of environmental certainty. That is, the United States knows what it wants. Government knows what it wants. And that environment supports organizational growth, and effective performance. So let's move on to the other two models. Okay, so the Jeffersonian model. Well, we know who Thomas Jefferson was, the author of the Declaration of Independence. Also the Virginia Statute on Religious Liberty and the founder of the University of Virginia. And that's what it says on Jefferson's tombstone, as a matter of fact. And if you go see Jefferson's tombstone in Charlottesville at Monticello, it doesn't say anything on his tombstone about being President of the United States, which is interesting. But he was author of the Declaration of Independence, and he had a strong belief in limited government and the power of the states. He was a firm supporter of the 10th Amendment, which reserves powers to the states. He opposed Hamilton's plan for the First Bank of the United States. And he opposed the federal government plan to pay off state Revolutionary War debts. And actually, Hamilton won that debate. And Jefferson himself had almost this mythical belief in the power of an agrarian republic. But what's interesting is one of the acts that President Jefferson is most remembered for is the Louisiana Purchase, where he basically doubled the size of the continental United States at the time by purchasing Louisiana from the French, really without any consultation with Congress. And he himself was actually afraid that that was perhaps unconstitutional, but it happened anyway. So, one of the things that Jefferson is noted for was really a Hamiltonian kind of act. But what is the legacy of the Jeffersonian tradition? Well, we still have this continuing debate over the power of the national government versus state governments, right? I mean, you can see this in action every day. Currently, we're arguing about health care. And the argument about health care, a lot of it is grounded in what should the states be responsible and what should the national government be responsible for. We argue about the state role versus the national role in a great many policy areas. And it's been going on since the founding of the Republic. And so this is due in large part to this Jeffersonian tradition. But what does it mean for the bureaucracy? So here we see our chart again with our inputs, our internal subsystem, and our outputs. Well, the internal subsystem in Jeffersonian thinking is that we have a limited and a decentralized structure, right? So in Jefferson's thinking, the government, especially the national government, could run on making maximum use of non-professionals, volunteers, political appointees, and private contractors. So really, in a sense, this is where the Jacksonian spoils system came from later on. And Jackson himself sort of carried it to an extreme. But the point is that, Jefferson said, look, government is run by citizen involvement and citizen volunteerism. So there were limits on how much input was going into the functioning of government. And what are the outputs of this? Well, the outputs are that government was strictly regulated, right? Goals were specifically defined and legally defined. There was limited administrative discretion. There were procedural controls and budgetary controls set on outputs with very little planning and decentralized service delivery. So this would be, in Jefferson's mind, the ideal. And so what is the feedback? The feedback really is something that we still value. We value a maximum opportunity for feedback from citizens and citizen involvement. And so actually you see this tradition at work as agencies, and not just elected politicians, but as agencies continue to strive to try to gain more citizen involvement. And so the environment assumes that we have kind of a virtuous citizenry who is politically active and is civic minded. That was the Jeffersonian model. And so you can see this really at work, especially in cities, right? You see cities who do strive to get citizen involvement in the functioning of government. It is a struggle sometimes, but it is really based on this Jeffersonian model. And so what is Madisonian? What is Madisonian democracy as we know it? It's a theory about how politics, the real politics in the United States, works in conjunction with American democracy. So, it was Madison who said ambition should be made to counteract ambition. So we do have a separation of powers government, not just at the national level, but really at the state level and pretty much at the local level as well. We recognize separation of powers as our constitutional tradition. And so going with that is a recognition that there are various interests that want something from governments at any level. And so we have this legacy in the Madisonian tradition, lots of legacies really. Our constitutional legacy is that we do value separation of powers. But we also recognize that people vote, and we recognize that there are various interests that have something to say as well. And so we have this idea that there's interest group liberalism. The idea that there's interest group liberalism means that interest groups can counteract interest groups. A lot of people claim that doesn't really work well in practice because some interest groups are much more powerful than other interest groups. But the point in the Madisonian tradition is that interests do try to offset and balance interests. And so here again, here's our chart. What is the internal subsystem? The internal subsystem is somewhat political, right? The bureaus aim at satisficing, which is a term from Herbert Simon, and we'll talk about later on in a few weeks, satisficing special interest of the agency it services. It's highly political in nature. There's fragmented formal structures, and there's sharing of authority with other units. So the point is that there are interests in the bureaucracy and interests outside the bureaucracy. And so what happens as a result of this? Well, the outputs are targeted and adjusted to special interest needs, demands, and requirements. And the feedback comes from these interests. So this sounds very cynical, but the point is in the Madisonian tradition that our separation of powers tradition actually keeps interests from becoming individually too powerful. That is the theory. And so finally, the Wilsonian tradition. So Wilson, of course, he's not a founding father, but he was influential. Maybe not immediately when he wrote that article in 1887, but later on when his work became more recognized. And so he famously said it's harder to run a constitution than to form one, meaning that administration had not kept up with the theory of government. And we know he said that politics should be separated from professional administration, and that professional administration denotes this idea that there is skill, that there is education, that there is discretion for administrators. So what's the legacy of the Wilsonian tradition? Well, again, we are living the legacy of the Wilsonian tradition, and that's this view that we can successfully separate politics, whatever we mean by that term, from administration. So we know that people often, and sometimes they don't though, make a distinction between elected officials and appointed officials. I mean, often elected officials even, and people running for office, refer to bureaucrats in a pejorative sense, right? They talk about unelected bureaucrats in Washington or Lincoln or somewhere making decisions for the people. How can they do that when they're not even elected? But we get this from the Wilsonian tradition. And so this is, I think you've seen this before, but this is my idea of what Wilson meant by, how government should work. And on the left-hand side, you have legitimacy, and on the right-hand side, you have accountability. And so in Wilson's mind, the people are sovereign by natural law, and then they form constitutions. These constitutions legitimize the formation of government through elections, and then elected officials, legitimized by that constitution, make policy, Administrators carry out the policy in a neutral manner, and then administrators are organized in some rational manner, and according to Wilson, the best model to use is the model of business, where rational decision making is thought to be the rule. So, legitimacy does flow down to the administrators from the natural law, really, but from the Constitution. So, public administrators do have legitimacy. And then accountability flows back up to the people. And so everyone in that chain is accountable to the people, not just the administrators, but also the elected officials as well. And so this chart is from the Stillman 1996 reading. Okay, there's a lot of information packed into this chart here, but let me just talk about it a little bit. What's important to keep in mind here is we talk about these traditions of governance, and we talk about how these traditions affect what we might call the bureaucracy or administration. But what's the point? The point is that we're living all of these traditions simultaneously all the time. And there are people whose views of how administration should work are based in large part in one or more of these traditions, right? And so it's important to keep in mind that all of these traditions affect not just the way we govern, but the way we run bureaucracy as well. And so look at the topics on the left-hand side there, those 7 or 8 different topics. And then across the top we have the Hamiltonian Tradition, the Jeffersonian Tradition, the Madisonian Tradition, and the Wilsonian Tradition. Take a look at what each of those boxes has to say about the topic and how those traditions affect them. And keep in mind how these apply to governance today, because I think you can start thinking of examples of how these traditions affect governance today. This chart here is from another Kettle text, but here's the point. The point is that these traditions actually can cross each other. So on the left-hand side, we have the Hamiltonian strong executive tradition with the Jeffersonian weak executive tradition, compared to the Wilsonian hierarchical tradition and the Madisonian balance of power tradition. So, it's possible to envision a Hamiltonian / Wilsonian bureaucracy with a strong executive, top-down authority, and hierarchical authority, right? You can kind of see that. But it's also possible to balance Hamilton with Madison. So, you might have government centered on nonprofit or non-bureaucratic institutions focused on political power, but still maintain this top-down accountability. And so you can see how these traditions can actually cross-reference each other and operate simultaneously. So, in fact, that's the end of this week's briefing. So, what I'd like you to do is work on the journal. The journal is going to ask you kind of to tie a bow around this idea of the legitimacy of public administration, keeping all these readings in mind. So please do keep sending your questions to me as you have them. I appreciate that a lot of you have continued to do that. So I'm looking forward to seeing your journals for this week. Thank you.